welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting idea, educational semiotics. You, our listener, sent in a fantastic article that asks a pretty direct question. Is this concept a threat or a menace to education? So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack exactly what educational semiotics is all about, explore why it's even being proposed in the first place, and figure out if it's, a helpful way for you to think about learning and teaching or something else entirely.
That's right. And we'll be focusing on Gary Shank's 1992 article, Educational Semiotic, Threat or Menace, which appeared in the Educational Psychology Review. It's worth noting, too, that Shank's piece isn't just coming out of nowhere. It's actually a response to an earlier article in the same issue by Donald Cunningham.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Cunningham was advocating for bringing semiotics into the field of educational psychology. So Shank is essentially taking a closer look at that very idea. Is this a path worth pursuing?
Okay, so let's get right into it then. According to Shank, what was the initial spark? What led to this whole notion of educational semiotics? What problem was it trying to solve?
Well, Shank highlights that Cunningham's main goal was really to raise awareness about semiotics within the educational psychology community. But Shank goes a step further. He sort of questions whether simply being aware of semiotics is enough.
Right.
His core argument, and what we'll be digging into today, is that a dedicated educational semiotic is indeed necessary. He believes it's crucial for developing what he calls an inquiry of understanding.
An inquiry of understanding.
Yeah, that should exist right alongside our current inquiry of knowledge. Think of it as moving beyond just knowing what works in education to really understanding why and how it carries meaning.
An inquiry of understanding versus an inquiry of knowledge.
Oh.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty fundamental shift. So where does this inquiry of understanding, this educational semiotic, actually come from? What are its roots?
Shank points us to two key figures, the real foundational thinkers in the field of semiotics, Ferdinand de Saussure and Charles S. Peirce. He considers them the founding fathers, you could say, whose ideas paved the way for this perspective.
Saussure and Peirce, right. Names that might sound familiar, but their actual contributions can be a bit hazy sometimes. Let's start with Saussure. What are the most important things for us to understand about his work and how it relates to this idea?
Okay, Saussure. He was a Swiss linguist. And what's fascinating is that his most influential work, Course in General Linguistics, wasn't even published by him. It was actually compiled by his students after his death from their notes on his lectures.
Really? From student notes?
Yeah. And Shank emphasizes Saussure's crucial distinction between diachronic and synchronic research. Diachronic linguistics looks at how language changes and evolves over historical time. Synchronic linguistics, on the other hand, examines language as a functioning system at a specific point in time.
Okay, can you give us a clear example of that difference, something we can easily grasp?
Absolutely. Shank himself uses the word psychologist. Diachronically, you could trace its origins back to the Greek word psyche, soul or mind.
Right.
But synchronically, we're interested in how the term psychologist is used today, and the network of related words that come to mind, like ethologist or psychiatrist. It's about understanding the current meaning and how the word functions within a broader system of related concepts right now, rather than just its historical journey.
So the meaning comes from its relationships with other words now.
Exactly. For Saussure, a word's meaning wasn't just fixed. It came from its relationships within the system.
So it's not just about looking up a definition in a dictionary, but understanding its place in a much larger web of meaning.
Precisely. And Saussure argued that to truly understand language, we need to consider both these historical roots and this present-day structural use. For him, the most fundamental unit of language was the sign. And a sign, for Saussure, is like a two-sided coin. It's the pairing of a signifier, which is the actual word sound or written mark, and a signified, which is the mental concept it represents in our minds.
Signifier and signified. Okay, those are terms you sometimes hear thrown around. What's the crucial point about their relationship, according to Saussure?
Well, Saussure's really radical insight was that the connection between the signifier and the signified is fundamentally arbitrary.
Arbitrary?
Yeah, there's no inherent logical reason why the sound tree should represent that tall, leafy thing outside. It's purely based on the shared rules and conventions of a particular language community. Shank uses the example of tree versus oak.
Okay.
Both refer to a type of plant, right? But they have different signifiers, and they evoke slightly different signifieds, different sets of associations within the overall language code.
Okay, so language isn't just a set of ready-made labels that we stick onto things in the world.
Yeah.
It's more complex than that.
Exactly. Saussure saw language as operating through these underlying, often unconscious, networks of representation, which he called codes.
Codes?
Yeah.
He believed that linguistics needed to analyze both the surface level of words and objects, what he somewhat simplified as denotation, the literal meaning, and these deeper structural relationships that provide a richer layer of meaning, what he called connotation.
Denotation and connotation.
Think of denotation as the basic dictionary definition, and connotation as all the extra baggage, all the associations a word carries with it.
And Schenck points out that Saussure's ideas weren't confined to just linguistics. They had a much broader impact, right?
Oh, absolutely. Schenck notes that thinkers across various disciplines like Roland Barthes, analyzing culture, Claude Levi-Strauss in anthropology, even figures like Piaget in cognitive development, indirectly at least, were deeply influenced by this Saussurean structuralist approach. So understanding these basic ideas of Saussure gives you a key to unlocking a lot of 20th century intellectual history, really.
Right, that's a good overview of Saussure. Now let's turn our attention to Charles S. Peirce. Schenck mentions he came from a very different intellectual background, logic.
Yeah.
What was his unique take on semiotics?
Right, Peirce. He was an American philosopher and logician, and unlike Saussure, he largely worked in relative isolation. His vast and, frankly, sometimes challenging body of work was compiled and interpreted after his death from his published and unpublished writings. Schenck highlights that Peirce was particularly interested in trying to bridge the philosophical divide between objectivism, the idea that there are objective truths out there, and relativism, the idea that truth is more dependent on individual or cultural perspectives.
That sounds like a pretty fundamental philosophical tension. How did Peirce attempt to reconcile those two seemingly opposing views?
Well, Peirce challenged the logical positivist notion that understanding something can be completely reduced to simply knowing it through empirical observation. He drew a crucial distinction between knowing, which for him was about establishing empirical facts and truths, and understanding, which involves grappling with the meaning of those facts and their potential consequences.
Knowing versus understanding. Can you give us a practical example to really illustrate that difference in Peirce's view?
Yeah, Schenck provides a very effective one. Consider a physician looking at an X-ray. The physician might know the diagnosis, let's say lung cancer, based purely on interpreting the visual data in the image.
Sure.
But understanding that diagnosis goes far beyond just that factual knowledge. It involves considering the implications for the patient's life, the potential causes, the available treatment options, the emotional and psychological impact, all of that. Simply knowing the truth of the diagnosis doesn't automatically equate to a full understanding of its significance.
That makes a lot of sense. So how did Peirce's model of the sign differ from Saussure's two-part model? How did it help bridge this gap between just knowing and truly understanding?
Well, Peirce developed what's known as a triadic model of the sign, which is quite different from Saussure's dyadic or two-part one. For Peirce, a sign involves three interconnected parts: the sign vehicle, which is similar to Saussure's signifier, the physical form of the sign, the object, which is what the sign refers to in the real world, and crucially, the interpretant.
The interpretant.
Yes. The interpretant is essentially the meaning and effect of the sign as it is interpreted by someone. It's the consequence of the sign, the understanding it produces in the mind. This interpretant is what bridges the gap between simply recognizing a sign and truly grasping its implications and significance. It connects the objective truth of the sign, perhaps, to its subjective meaning for the interpreter.
Ah, okay. So, while Sausage focused primarily on the relationship between a word and a concept within a language system, Peirce brought in the crucial role of the interpreter and the broader consequences, the meaning-making that happens when someone encounters a sign.
Exactly. And Schenck argues that this Peircean framework is particularly valuable for moving beyond just establishing empirical truth in educational research. It helps us delve into the deeper meaning and significance of various educational phenomena, how students interpret a lesson, how teachers understand their roles, things like that.
Okay, so we've got these foundational ideas from Saussure and Peirce. Now, how does Schenck specifically argue that these ideas are relevant to educational inquiry? Why does he believe we need this dedicated educational semiotic?
Schenck's central argument is that much of current educational psychology research tends to focus too narrowly on establishing the empirical truth of claims. Does this teaching method improve test scores? Is this intervention effective?
Yeah, the standard stuff.
Right. And while that's important, he contends that this approach is incomplete because it largely overlooks the critical dimension of understanding meaning. He advocates for the development of an empirical inquiry of meaning that would complement the existing inquiry of truth.
And he has some specific criticisms of Cunningham's earlier article in this context, right? The one that prompted his response.
Yes, exactly. Shank's main critique of Cunningham is that Cunningham primarily focuses on epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and tends to frame semiotics mainly as a tool for critiquing objectivist research methods.
Ah, just as a critique tool.
Yeah, Shank believes this perspective is too limited. He argues that an educational semiotic isn't just about questioning how we know what we know in education, but about developing a whole new and richer way of understanding the processes and outcomes of education itself.
So it's not just a critical lens, but a potential framework for generating new kinds of research questions and approaches in education.
Precisely. Shank envisions an educational semiotic broadening the scope of research to explore how various codes of meaning, those underlying networks of signification we discussed with Saussure, simultaneously shape and inform our inquiries within the field of education. He even proposes a potential shift in emphasis from what he calls theory-driven research to ideology-driven research.
Mm.
And here, he defines ideology not in the political sense, necessarily, but as the prevailing belief system within a particular culture or educational context.
Okay, interesting definition.
Yeah. So this would mean understanding research findings not just in relation to a specific educational theory, but also within the broader context of cultural codes, beliefs, and values that influence how we perceive and interpret educational practices.
That's a pretty significant shift in perspective.
Bah.
Okay, so getting back to the title of Shank's article, he poses the question, is educational semiotics a threat or a menace? Let's first consider the idea of it being a threat. What are the potential threats that he himself identifies?
Well, Shank outlines three main ways in which educational semiotics might be perceived as a threat. First, there's the argument that it's simply irrelevant. That it's just academic navel-gazing, irrelevant to the real work of educational research, and would only serve to distract from genuine progress.
Okay.
Irrelevance. Second, there's the concern that it's fundamentally flawed from a theoretical standpoint, that it would lead educational psychology down a kind of unproductive path.
Wrong-headed, basically.
Right. And third, there's the worry that its methods are inherently fuzzy and imprecise, making it difficult to generate reliable and meaningful findings. Methodological issues.
Okay, irrelevance, theoretically wrong, methodologically fuzzy. And how does Shank address and counter each of these potential threats?
Well, to the argument of irrelevance, Shank points out that many Saussurian concepts are actually already implicitly embedded in much of current educational research and practice, even if researchers aren't explicitly using the terminology. He argues that a more conscious and informed understanding of these underlying principles could actually enhance the rigor and depth of our inquiries, not distract from them.
So it's already there, just not named.
In a way, yes. Regarding the concern that it's theoretically misguided, Shank suggests that semiotics offers a valuable alternative to the limitations of, say, logical positivism, a philosophical approach that has faced significant critiques within the broader academic community anyway. So instead of seeing it as a dead end, he views it as a potentially more fruitful framework for addressing both the issues of meaning and truth in education.
Okay, and the fuzziness, the methodological worries.
Right. In response to those, Shank emphasizes that embracing semiotics doesn't necessitate abandoning all existing research methods. Those methods remain valuable for verifying empirical claims, for establishing truth. The key point, he argues, is that they provide an incomplete picture if they don't also account for the crucial dimension of meaning-making. Semiotics, he believes, provides that necessary additional lens. It completes the picture.
Okay, so Shank seems to effectively argue against the idea of educational semiotics being a clear and present threat, at least in those specific ways. Now let's move on to the second part of the question. What about it being a menace? He suggests this is more about a general feeling of unease, maybe some inarticulated concerns.
Precisely. Shank describes this sense of menace as a kind of vague foreboding, a feeling that even if educational semiotics doesn't pose a specific identifiable threat, its introduction into the field of education could lead to unspecified but serious problems, or maybe just a fundamental unsettling of established norms.
A disturbance in the force, perhaps.
Something like that. And to explore this more subtle sense of unease, he employs a really thought-provoking technique he calls the method of juxtaposition.
Juxtaposition. What exactly does that involve in this context?
It's a semiotic technique that Shank himself developed, actually. It's based on the idea that when you intentionally place two seemingly dissimilar but nonetheless well-known things side by side, it sort of compels the observer, in this case, you, the listener, or the educational psychology community to actively create meaningful connections and derive new insights.
Mm.
He argues that the more unexpected or arbitrary the connection between the two things being juxtaposed, the more unique and potentially illuminating the resulting insights can be.
Okay, so forcing a comparison to spark new thought. And what are the two seemingly dissimilar things that Shank juxtaposes in order to explore this feeling of menace?
He strategically places the somewhat abstract and perhaps unfamiliar concept of educational semiotics right alongside a very specific and emotionally resonant scene from W. Jacobs' famous and really unsettling short story, The Monkey's Paw.
The monkey's paw. Wow. Okay. A classic tale with a real sense of dread. For those of us who might need a quick reminder, can you give us a brief overview of the story's plot?
Certainly. Yeah, it's a great story. It centers around an elderly couple in England, the Whites, who are visited by a retired sergeant major who served in India. He brings with him this mummified monkey's paw that is said to have the power to grant 3 wishes to 3 different owners.
Right, the 3 wishes.
But the sergeant major warns them of its dangerous nature. He recounts how the wishes often come with terrible and unforeseen consequences, bringing more sorrow than joy. Despite his warnings, Mr. White impulsively takes the paw and decides to test its power. His first wish is for a modest sum of money, £200.
Okay.
Shortly after, they receive that exact amount, but only as compensation after their beloved son is tragically killed in a gruesome accident at his workplace.
Oh, terrible.
Yeah. Overwhelmed with grief, the mother then insists on using the second wish to bring their son back to life, despite the father's growing fear of what a resurrected and likely horribly disfigured son might be like.
Yeah, you can imagine.
Exactly. So late one dark night, there's this frantic and persistent knocking at their front door. Terrified that it is his son, brought back in some horrifying state, the father frantically uses the final wish just as his wife is about to open the door. He wishes him back to the grave, essentially.
Oh, man.
And when he finally manages to get the door open, there is no one there, just the empty, quiet street.
Chilling. That final scene is truly haunting. So how does Shank draw a connection between this really chilling story and the idea of educational semiotics being a menace?
Shank focuses on the intense fear and uncertainty that Mr. White experiences in that final moment as he hears the knocking at the door. He doesn't actually know for certain that it's his son who has returned, or what state his son might be in. He can only guess.
Right, it's the not knowing.
Exactly. But based on the horrific consequences of the first wish, he anticipates a terrifying and unwelcome meaning associated with that knocking. Driven by this fear of the potential reality, the potential meaning, he acts decisively to prevent that meaning from fully materializing, even though he remains uncertain about what was truly on the other side of the door. And as a result, the story concludes with this lingering sense of dread and unresolved fear we, as readers, never definitively learn the cause of the knocking. Was it the sun? Was it something else?
So the fear of the potential meaning, the anticipated consequences, is what drives Mr. White's action, even more so than knowing the actual reality.
That's precisely the parallel Shank is drawing. He suggests that educational psychologists might be experiencing a similar kind of unease or apprehension towards educational semiotics, a fear of the unknown meanings, the implications, the potential disruptions that it might introduce to their established ways of thinking about and conducting research in education.
Like Mr. White fearing what's behind the door.
Exactly. They might feel more comfortable clinging to familiar theoretical frameworks and methodologies, even if those approaches are maybe yielding limited or uninspired results, rather than confronting the potentially unsettling new perspectives and understandings that a semiotic lens could reveal.
He then goes on to draw a historical parallel with the resistance that Galileo faced with his telescope, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. Those who opposed Galileo's findings often did so out of a fear that these new ways of determining truth about the cosmos would undermine their deeply held beliefs and challenge the established authority of the time.
Fear the new truth.
Right, and Shank argues that a similar fear of meaning, or perhaps more specifically, a fear of new ways of determining meaning in education that go beyond familiar positivist approaches, could lead to a comparable resistance to educational semiotics. Just as scientific methods of ascertaining truth eventually gained acceptance and reshaped our understanding of the world, Shank suggests that inquiry in many diverse fields is increasingly recognizing the crucial role of signification and meaning-making.
So other fields are embracing this.
Increasingly, yes. And he implies that educational psychology risks being left behind if it dismisses these trends out of fear, out of that sort of vague menace.
So the real menace in this context isn't the field of educational semiotics itself, but rather the potential fear of exploring new and perhaps challenging ways of understanding education and learning. The fear of opening the door, so to speak.
That's the core of Schnick's argument, yes.
Okay.
He urges educational psychologists to maintain an open and receptive attitude towards the potential insights that semiotics can offer regarding the fundamental role of meaning and signs within the field of education. He cautions against allowing a fear of meaning to prevent them from engaging with these novel perspectives.
Right.
He concludes by encouraging a thoughtful reevaluation of Cunningham's original article with a more open mind, suggesting that resisting new ideas solely out of apprehension will ultimately hinder the progress and richness of educational inquiry.
Okay, so to summarize our deep dive into Shank's article, educational semiotics, drawing on the foundational work of Saussure and Peirce, essentially proposes that we need to place a crucial emphasis not only on establishing what is empirically true in education, but also on deeply understanding the various layers of meaning that are inherent in the educational process.
Exactly.
And it seems that any resistance to this idea might stem more from a general unease about the unknown implications of the menace rather than from any fundamental flaws in the core concepts themselves, which he argues aren't really a threat.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that the constriction and interpretation of meaning are just as vital to our comprehensive understanding of education as the establishment of objective facts. Maybe even more so sometimes.
This has been a truly illuminating deep dive into a complex but, yeah, fascinating area, considering these core concepts of signifier, signified, and that Pearson interpretant. It really makes you think about how this framework could fundamentally alter the way you analyze even your own everyday communications and learning experiences.
Absolutely. And I think it would be valuable for you, our listener, to maybe consider the often unseen underlying codes that operate within your own field of work or areas of personal interest. Could focusing more explicitly on the creation and interpretation of meaning offer some fresh perspectives or even challenge some of your existing assumptions?
Definitely gives you food for thought.
Hmm.
So the final takeaway here seems to be, let's not allow a potential fear of meaning, like Mr. White at the door, to prevent us from exploring new intellectual avenues that could significantly enrich our understanding of education and the intricate ways in which we learn. Thanks so much for exploring this deep dive with me today.
It was my pleasure. Really interesting stuff.